Last Tuesday morning, while I was checking the fence line along the eastern pasture of my 847-acre farm in Millerville County, Nebraska, my 41-year-old daughter Jennifer drove up in her brand new Tesla Model S and informed me that she had already contacted 3 different real estate developers about selling our family land for a massive suburban housing development that would generate over $15 million in profit and finally allow me to live comfortably in my old age, instead of wasting my remaining years maintaining what she called this worthless dirt farm that nobody in our family actually wants or needs anymore. What Jennifer didn't know as she delivered her shocking ultimatum about selling the land that had been in our family for 4 generations was that her supposedly struggling farmer father had been secretly working with the Nebraska Environmental Trust and the Nature Conservancy for the past 18 months to permanently protect this pristine prairie ecosystem as a wildlife preserve that would honor her late mother's environmental values while ensuring that no developer would ever be able to destroy the wetlands, native grasslands, and migratory bird habitat that Jennifer viewed as nothing more than potential profit margins. I'm Walter Thornfield. I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of how my daughter's greedy demand to sell our family farm for suburban development triggered the most devastating conservation decision that would permanently block her inheritance dreams while creating a lasting environmental legacy that would protect this land forever from the kind of destructive development that puts profit over preservation and family history. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The emotional devastation of my daughter's development demand represented the complete betrayal of everything her mother Sarah and I had worked to build during 43 years of marriage and sustainable farming that had transformed this property from degraded agricultural land into a thriving ecosystem that supported over 200 species of native plants, 67 bird species, and countless small mammals that depended on our careful stewardship and conservation practices for their survival. The stakes involved in Jennifer's shocking proposal extended far beyond my personal hurt feelings to include the potential destruction of irreplaceable prairie habitat that had taken decades to restore, along with the violation of promises I had made to Sarah on her deathbed 3 years ago to protect this land from exactly the kind of commercial development that Jennifer was now demanding with complete disregard for our family's conservation values and environmental commitments. My emotional investment in this farm represented not only 4 generations of Thornfield family history, but also 22 years of intensive habitat restoration work that Sarah and I had undertaken with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission to reestablish native plant communities, create wetland areas for migratory waterfowl, and develop sustainable farming practices that proved environmental protection and agricultural productivity could coexist successfully when managed with proper knowledge and long-term commitment. The reputational risks involved in Jennifer's development pressure included the potential destruction of my standing in the local conservation community, where I had served on the County Conservation Board for 15 years and worked closely with environmental organizations to promote sustainable land use practices that balanced economic needs with ecological responsibility. Making her profit-focused demands particularly painful, given my public advocacy for farmland preservation and habitat protection throughout central Nebraska. The historical significance of our family farm extends back to 1889, when my great-grandfather Heinrich Thornfield received this land as part of the Homestead Act and began the challenging process of converting native prairie into productive agricultural land that could support his growing family during the harsh frontier conditions that characterized late 19th century Nebraska settlement patterns and agricultural development. Heinrich's original farmstead included a modest sod house that still stands in our north pasture, as a reminder of the pioneering spirit and environmental adaptation that allowed our family to establish deep roots in this specific landscape that has supported 4 generations of Thornfield farmers through economic depressions, world wars, drought cycles, and dramatic changes in agricultural technology and environmental understanding. My grandfather, Ernest Thornfield, expanded the original homestead through additional land purchases during the 1920s and 1930s, developing innovative crop rotation systems and soil conservation practices that were considered advanced for their time and reflected the family's commitment to long-term land stewardship rather than short-term profit maximization that often characterized agricultural practices during periods of economic uncertainty and environmental stress. My father, Robert Thornfield, inherited the expanded farm operation during the 1950s and began the first systematic efforts to restore portions of the original prairie ecosystem through selective land retirement programs and native plant reestablishment projects that laid the foundation for the comprehensive habitat restoration work that Sarah and I would later undertake with professional guidance from wildlife biologists and conservation organizations. The transformation of my daughter's development demand into steely environmental determination began exactly 37 minutes after her shocking ultimatum. When I realized that her complete disregard for our family's conservation legacy had actually provided me with the perfect opportunity to permanently protect this land through legal mechanisms that would ensure no future generations could ever destroy the prairie ecosystem that Sarah and I had spent decades restoring for the benefit of wildlife and environmental education that extends far beyond immediate family financial interests. The clarity of my conservation decision was intensified by vivid memories of Sarah's final weeks, when she spent countless hours sitting by our pond watching migrating waterfowl and expressing her deep concern about the increasing development pressures that were destroying similar habitat areas throughout our region. Along with her specific requests that I promise to protect our restored prairie areas regardless of family financial pressures or inheritance expectations that might prioritize immediate profit over long-term environmental stewardship and wildlife conservation. My emotional transformation from devastated father to determined conservationist was further strengthened by recognition that Jennifer's development ultimatum represented exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that had already destroyed thousands of acres of irreplaceable prairie habitat throughout Nebraska, and that my decision to pursue permanent conservation protection could serve as an important model for other private landowners facing similar development pressures from family members or economic circumstances that threatened ecologically significant properties. The systematic documentation of Jennifer's anti-environmental attitudes began 5 years ago when she started working as a commercial real estate agent in Omaha and began making disparaging comments about wasted agricultural land and missed development opportunities that revealed her complete transformation from the nature-loving child who had helped her mother plant native wildflowers into a profit-focused professional who viewed undeveloped land as nothing more than potential suburban subdivisions and shopping centers. Jennifer's evolution from an environmentally conscious teenager who had volunteered at the local wildlife refuge and written her high school senior thesis on prairie conservation into a development-obsessed adult became increasingly obvious through her criticism of our sustainable farming practices. Her complaints about the inconvenience of visiting the farm during bird migration seasons, when we requested quiet behavior to avoid disturbing wildlife, and her suggestions that we should maximize short-term agricultural profits rather than maintaining habitat areas that reduced our cultivated acreage, but provided essential ecosystem services for regional wildlife populations. The evidence of Jennifer's materialistic transformation accumulated through dozens of conversations, where she questioned our decision to maintain prairie restoration areas instead of planting more profitable corn and soybeans, criticized our participation in conservation easement programs that limited future development options, and expressed open frustration with our financial support for local environmental organizations that she viewed as obstacles to economic development and property value maximization that could benefit our family's financial security. Jennifer's husband, Marcus, a commercial developer from Lincoln with extensive experience in suburban expansion projects, provided additional pressure for land conversion through his detailed presentations about potential subdivision layouts that could accommodate over 3,000 housing units. His sophisticated financial calculations of per-acre development profits that emphasized the enormous wealth generation potential of our strategically located property, and his professional connections with construction companies and municipal planning departments that could expedite site preparation and infrastructure development if we agreed to sell the property for residential development that would represent one of the largest suburban expansion projects in central Nebraska history. Marcus's development proposals included glossy architectural renderings of luxury housing subdivisions with names like Prairie View Estates and Thornfield Manor that would ironically commemorate our family name, while completely destroying the prairie ecosystem that had defined our environmental values and conservation work for over 2 decades of intensive habitat restoration efforts. The financial projections that Marcus presented during family gatherings included detailed breakdowns of development costs, profit margins, and timeline estimates that revealed his sophisticated understanding of the commercial development process, and his confidence that our property represented an exceptional opportunity for wealth generation that could transform our family's economic status while satisfying growing demand for suburban housing in our rapidly expanding metropolitan region. The escalation of Jennifer's development pressure intensified dramatically last fall when property values in our county increased substantially due to Omaha's suburban expansion and the completion of new highway connections that made our rural area more accessible to urban commuters seeking affordable housing options in scenic rural settings that offered the appearance of country living, while maintaining convenient access to metropolitan employment and entertainment opportunities. Jennifer's increasingly aggressive approach to development advocacy included organizing family meetings where Marcus and his business partners presented comprehensive development proposals complete with traffic studies, environmental impact assessments that minimized ecological concerns, and financial projections showing how farm sale proceeds could provide me with luxury retirement living, while generating substantial inheritance wealth that would secure her family's financial future and fund her children's college education without requiring continued agricultural work or property maintenance responsibilities that she viewed as unnecessarily burdensome for someone of my advanced age. The pressure tactics employed by Jennifer and Marcus included subtle suggestions that my continued farming activities at age 73 represented unsafe behavior that could result in serious injury, along with implications that my environmental conservation priorities reflected declining mental capacity and poor financial judgment that threatened our family's economic security and required intervention from younger family members who could make more rational decisions about property utilization and wealth maximization strategies. The breaking point in our relationship came during Christmas dinner last year when Jennifer publicly announced to our entire extended family that she considered my environmental conservation work to be selfish hobby farming that was preventing her children from accessing their rightful inheritance, and that she intended to pursue legal options to force property sale if I continued to resist her reasonable development proposals that would benefit everyone involved, except the birds and wild animals that she dismissed as economically worthless and environmentally insignificant compared to human family financial needs and security requirements. Jennifer's shocking Christmas declaration included detailed accusations that my conservation activities were evidence of declining mental capacity and poor financial judgment that threatened our family's economic security, along with specific threats to involve attorneys and financial advisors who could help her gain legal control over property decisions that she claimed I was no longer competent to make in the best interests of our family's financial future and economic prosperity. The public nature of Jennifer's Christmas ultimatum was particularly devastating because it revealed her willingness to humiliate me in front of relatives and family friends who had always respected our conservation work and environmental advocacy, while also exposing her complete lack of understanding or appreciation for the ecological significance of our restored prairie habitat that had become regionally recognized as a successful model of private land conservation and sustainable agriculture integration. The detailed development proposal that Jennifer presented during her Christmas confrontation included specific plans to destroy our most ecologically valuable wetland areas for luxury housing lots that would command premium prices due to their scenic water views, revealing her complete ignorance of the critical role these restored wetlands played in supporting migratory bird populations, providing flood control services for our local watershed, and maintaining groundwater quality that benefited our entire rural community through natural filtration and aquifer recharge processes that would be permanently disrupted by residential development and associated infrastructure construction. Jennifer's cavalier attitude toward wetland destruction was particularly shocking because she had spent her childhood helping Sarah monitor bird populations in these same areas, participating in annual Christmas bird counts that documented the increasing diversity of waterfowl species that had returned as our restoration efforts matured, and learning about the complex ecological relationships that connected our local habitat improvements to regional wildlife migration patterns that depended on networks of protected areas for successful reproduction and survival. The pivotal moment when my disappointment transformed into strategic conservation planning occurred during Jennifer's Christmas tirade, when she mentioned that Marcus had already identified specific lots within our wetland restoration areas that would be perfect for luxury housing developments with premium pricing due to their scenic water views, revealing that her development plans would specifically target and destroy the most ecologically valuable portions of our carefully restored habitat areas that supported the greatest diversity of wildlife species and provided the most important environmental services for our local ecosystem. This devastating revelation confirmed that Jennifer's development proposal was not simply about converting unused agricultural land into profitable housing, but represented a deliberate attack on the most environmentally significant portions of our property that had required the most intensive restoration work and provided the greatest conservation value for regional wildlife populations and ecological connectivity between remaining natural areas throughout our fragmented landscape. My decision to accelerate the conservation-preservation process began immediately after New Year's Day when I contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the Nebraska Environmental Trust to discuss emergency options for permanent land protection that would prevent any possibility of future development, while honoring the conservation values that Sarah and I had shared throughout our marriage and environmental advocacy work in central Nebraska's conservation community. Dr. Rodriguez's enthusiastic response to my conservation inquiry included detailed explanations of conservation easement options that would permanently protect the land, while allowing me to retain ownership and continue sustainable farming practices that complemented habitat preservation goals. Along with comprehensive information about significant tax benefits and conservation grants that would provide financial compensation for development rights that I was voluntarily surrendering for environmental protection purposes. The initial consultation with Dr. Rodriguez revealed that our property had been identified by state conservation organizations as a priority area for protection due to its exceptional ecological value, strategic location within regional wildlife corridors, and successful demonstration of integrated conservation and agricultural practices that could serve as a model for other private landowners facing similar development pressures throughout the Great Plains region. The legal documentation process for permanent conservation protection required extensive environmental surveys and habitat assessments conducted by professional biologists from the Nature Conservancy, the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and the University of Nebraska's School of Natural Resources, all of whom confirmed the exceptional ecological value of our restored prairie ecosystems, with particular emphasis on the rare native plant communities and critical migratory bird habitat that had been carefully developed over 2 decades of intensive restoration work, guided by scientific research and professional wildlife management expertise. The comprehensive biological surveys documented the presence of several rare and endangered plant species that had been successfully reestablished through our restoration efforts, including the western prairie fringed orchid and the small white lady slipper, both of which required specific habitat conditions that could only be maintained through continued conservation management and would be permanently lost if the property were converted to residential development. The bird population studies revealed that our restored wetlands and grasslands supported 43 species of breeding birds and provided critical stopover habitat for an additional 24 species of migratory birds that depended on our carefully managed habitat areas for successful reproduction and long-distance migration between breeding and wintering grounds throughout North and South America. The conservation easement negotiations included detailed provisions for public education access that would allow school groups, university research teams, and environmental organizations to visit our property for hands-on learning about prairie ecology, sustainable agriculture, and conservation success stories that demonstrated the positive environmental and economic outcomes possible when private landowners commit to long-term habitat protection and scientific management practices. The educational access provisions were carefully structured to protect wildlife during sensitive breeding and migration seasons, while maximizing opportunities for environmental education that could inspire future generations of conservation advocates and provide practical training for land managers, agricultural professionals, and conservation scientists who needed real-world examples of successful ecosystem restoration and integrated land use management strategies. The financial arrangements for conservation easement establishment included substantial federal and state tax credits that would provide immediate economic benefits, along with annual conservation payments from multiple government and nonprofit programs that would generate long-term revenue streams exceeding what traditional agricultural leasing or development would provide over my remaining lifetime, while also ensuring permanent protection for habitat areas that could never be recreated once destroyed by residential or commercial development pressures. The complex financial calculations prepared by conservation economists demonstrated that permanent land protection would actually provide greater total economic return than Jennifer's proposed development sale, while also generating ongoing income for property management and conservation activities that would maintain habitat quality and educational value in perpetuity through professional management by qualified conservation organizations. The secret nature of my conservation planning was intentional and designed to prevent Jennifer from interfering with legal processes through lawsuits, injunctions, or family pressure tactics that might delay or complicate the permanent protection mechanisms that were essential to ensuring long-term habitat preservation, regardless of future ownership changes or family conflicts about land use priorities and economic development pressures that continued to threaten similar properties throughout our region. The confidential negotiations with conservation organizations allowed me to complete all necessary legal documentation and environmental assessments without interference from Jennifer or Marcus, whose commercial development interests would have motivated them to challenge or undermine conservation processes that threatened their profit expectations and inheritance assumptions about property disposal and wealth generation strategies. Jennifer's second major development ultimatum came on that devastating Tuesday morning in March, when she arrived unannounced at my farmhouse with a thick folder full of development contracts, legal documents, and architectural plans that required my immediate signature to begin site preparation for the massive suburban expansion project that would generate millions in immediate profits, while permanently destroying 4 generations of family agricultural history and 2 decades of painstaking environmental restoration work that could never be replicated or restored once concrete subdivisions and asphalt parking lots replaced native prairie ecosystems and restored wetland habitats. Jennifer's presentation of the development ultimatum included aggressive arguments about my moral responsibility to provide financial security for her children's futures, along with sophisticated emotional manipulation about Sarah's supposed wishes for family prosperity that completely ignored her mother's passionate environmental advocacy and her explicit deathbed requests for land conservation that I had solemnly promised to honor regardless of economic pressures or family conflicts about property development priorities and inheritance expectations. The moment of ultimate betrayal occurred when Jennifer revealed that she had already signed preliminary agreements with developers contingent on my consent, and that she had been secretly meeting with attorneys specializing in elder law and property disputes to explore legal options for forcing property sale through competency challenges or inheritance disputes that would circumvent my conservation preferences and environmental commitments in favor of immediate development profits that would enrich her family at the expense of irreplaceable ecological resources and family conservation legacy. Jennifer's disclosure of her secret legal consultations included specific threats to challenge my mental competency through court-ordered psychological evaluations and financial capacity assessments that could potentially give her legal authority to make property decisions on my behalf, revealing her willingness to destroy our family relationships entirely and publicly question my mental health, rather than accept my environmental values and conservation priorities as legitimate expressions of my personal values and property rights. The devastating climax of Jennifer's development ultimatum included her callous dismissal of my concerns about wildlife habitat destruction, with the shocking comment that dead animals don't pay for college tuition or retirement homes, followed by her declaration that she considered environmental conservation to be a luxury that our family could no longer afford given her children's educational expenses and her own desires for financial security that took precedence over what she called my sentimental attachment to weeds and birds, that prevented rational economic decision-making about property utilization and wealth maximization opportunities. This moment of moral bankruptcy revealed the complete transformation of my daughter from the environmentally conscious child who had once cried when she accidentally stepped on a butterfly into a materialistic adult who viewed wildlife and natural ecosystems as obstacles to financial gain rather than irreplaceable components of our regional environmental heritage that deserved protection for their intrinsic value and ecological importance. My emotional transformation from hurt parent into determined conservationist reached its ultimate peak when Jennifer's cruel dismissal of wildlife value triggered vivid memories of Sarah's passionate environmental advocacy and her specific concerns about development pressures that were destroying critical habitat throughout our region. Along with her explicit requests that I continue our conservation work regardless of family opposition or financial pressures that might threaten the ecological legacy we had worked so hard to establish on our family property. The crystallization of my conservation resolve was further strengthened by recognition that Jennifer's development demands represented exactly the kind of short-sighted environmental destruction that Sarah had dedicated her life to preventing through education, advocacy, and personal example of successful private land conservation that could inspire other landowners to prioritize long-term ecological health over immediate financial gain. The decisive action that would change everything forever began that same Tuesday afternoon when I drove directly to the Nature Conservancy office in Lincoln and signed the final conservation easement documents that would permanently protect our 847-acre farm as the Sarah Thornfield Memorial Wildlife Preserve, ensuring that no future owner could ever develop or destroy the prairie habitat that represented my late wife's environmental legacy and our family's most meaningful contribution to wildlife conservation and ecological preservation in central Nebraska. The conservation easement signing ceremony included Dr. Rodriguez and 3 other environmental scientists who had been working on our habitat assessments for over a year, along with representatives from the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, who would be responsible for ongoing monitoring and management of the preserved ecosystem that would serve as a model for private land conservation throughout the Great Plains region and provide critical habitat connectivity between existing protected areas. The legal documentation for permanent conservation protection included comprehensive restrictions on any development activities that could harm habitat integrity, detailed habitat management plans that would guide future land stewardship decisions based on scientific research and wildlife population monitoring, and sophisticated financial provisions that would fund ongoing conservation work while providing me with sustainable income that exceeded what traditional agricultural leasing would generate over my remaining lifetime. The conservation easement terms also included specific provisions for research partnerships with regional universities, educational programs for school groups and conservation organizations, and public access for wildlife observation and environmental education that would extend the conservation impact far beyond simple habitat protection, to include inspiring future generations of environmental advocates and conservation scientists. The immediate aftermath of the conservation easement signing included my phone call to Jennifer that evening to inform her that our family farm had been permanently donated to environmental conservation and would never be available for development under any circumstances, regardless of inheritance laws, family financial pressures, or legal challenges that prioritized short-term profit over long-term environmental protection and wildlife habitat preservation. Jennifer's initial reaction to learning about the conservation dedication was several minutes of stunned silence, followed by explosive anger and accusations of financial sabotage that revealed her primary concern was losing access to development profits, rather than any genuine appreciation for land conservation or environmental protection that should have honored her mother's memory and lifelong environmental values. The devastating confrontation that followed included Jennifer's hysterical threats to challenge the conservation easement through every possible legal avenue, her accusations that I had been manipulated by environmental extremists who cared more about animals than human family financial security, and her declaration that she would never forgive me for destroying her children's inheritance, prospects, through what she called selfish environmental fanaticism that prioritized wildlife over human family needs and economic prosperity. My detailed explanation to Jennifer about the conservation decision included comprehensive discussion of her mother's environmental values and her explicit deathbed requests for habitat protection that took absolute precedence over financial considerations, along with extensive information about the educational and research opportunities that the wildlife preserve would provide for future generations of students and scientists who would benefit from studying intact prairie ecosystems that were becoming increasingly rare throughout the Great Plains region due to agricultural intensification and urban development pressures. Jennifer's complete refusal to acknowledge her mother's conservation priorities or understand the ecological significance of our restored habitat areas confirmed that her opposition to land preservation was based entirely on financial greed, rather than any legitimate concern for family welfare or respect for Sarah's environmental legacy that had been the defining passion of her adult life and her most important contribution to regional conservation advocacy and environmental education. Throughout central Nebraska, the final rupture in our family relationship occurred when Jennifer announced that she would be contesting Sarah's will through probate court challenges, questioning my mental competency through court-ordered psychological evaluations, and pursuing legal action to invalidate the conservation easement through claims of undue influence and financial mismanagement, revealing her willingness to destroy our family relationships entirely and subject me to public humiliation, rather than accept that environmental conservation could be more important than immediate financial gain and real estate development profits that would enrich her at the expense of irreplaceable ecological resources. Jennifer's threats of comprehensive legal warfare included specific plans to involve elder abuse investigators, financial exploitation specialists, and property rights attorneys who would challenge every aspect of my conservation decision through multiple legal venues that could potentially tie up the property in litigation for years, while generating substantial legal costs that would drain family resources and create ongoing stress and conflict that could seriously impact my health and well-being during my remaining years. The legal protections built into the conservation easement documents included specific provisions preventing family challenges or inheritance disputes from affecting the permanent conservation status. With detailed documentation of my mental competency, prepared by multiple medical professionals and comprehensive records of my voluntary decision-making process that would prevent successful legal challenges based on claims of diminished capacity or undue influence from environmental organizations. The conservation easement terms also included sophisticated financial mechanisms that would generate ongoing revenue through educational programs, research partnerships, carbon credit sales, and sustainable agriculture activities that would provide long-term income streams while maintaining habitat integrity and wildlife protection goals that honored Sarah's memory and environmental values throughout the duration of the permanent conservation protection. The Nature Conservancy's commitment to ongoing land management included professional biologists who would conduct annual wildlife population surveys, maintain native plant communities through prescribed burning and invasive species control, develop comprehensive educational programs that would bring thousands of visitors to learn about prairie ecology and conservation success stories, and coordinate research partnerships with universities and government agencies that would advance scientific understanding of ecosystem restoration and sustainable land management practices throughout the Great Plains region. The long-term management plan also included provisions for climate change adaptation strategies that would help wildlife populations and plant communities adjust to changing environmental conditions while maintaining the ecological integrity and conservation value that justified permanent protection of this exceptional prairie ecosystem. 6 months after the devastating conservation decision that permanently blocked Jennifer's development dreams, our family relationships have stabilized into patterns of minimal communication, where she continues to pursue unsuccessful legal challenges, while I work closely with environmental organizations to develop the educational and research programs that will ensure the Sarah Thornfield Memorial Wildlife Preserve becomes a lasting contribution to conservation science and environmental education throughout the Great Plains region, and serves as an inspiration for other private landowners facing similar development pressures from family members or economic circumstances. Jennifer's continued legal challenges have been repeatedly unsuccessful due to the comprehensive documentation of my mental competency and the voluntary nature of my conservation decision, while her attempts to generate broader family pressure for easement reversal have been complicated by the permanent legal status of conservation dedications that cannot be changed regardless of family disputes, financial hardships, or inheritance expectations that prioritize immediate profit over environmental protection and ecological stewardship. The positive impact of the wildlife preserve has already begun attracting significant attention from universities and research institutions throughout the Midwest who want to establish long-term study sites for prairie ecology research, climate change impact studies, and sustainable agriculture investigations that require protected areas with stable management and guaranteed long-term access for scientific research that could extend over decades or generations of ongoing study. Local schools have started bringing students for educational field trips that teach children about native plant communities, wildlife habitat requirements, bird identification and migration patterns, and the importance of private land conservation for protecting biodiversity and ecosystem services that benefit entire regional communities through improved water quality, flood control, carbon sequestration, and wildlife population support that extends far beyond property boundaries. The scientific recognition of our conservation success has included publication of research studies documenting the exceptional ecological value of our restored habitats. with particular emphasis on the rare plant species populations and critical wildlife corridors that would have been permanently destroyed by Jennifer's proposed suburban development that prioritized immediate financial gain over irreplaceable environmental resources and ecological services that cannot be recreated once natural ecosystems have been converted to concrete subdivisions and commercial developments that fragment regional habitat networks and eliminate essential wildlife. Migration routes. The research publications have generated additional interest from conservation organizations and government agencies who view our property as a model for successful private land conservation that demonstrates environmental protection and economic viability, can coexist successfully when managed with proper planning and long-term commitment to ecological stewardship rather than short-term profit maximization. My ongoing work with conservation organizations has expanded to include advisory roles with other private landowners throughout Nebraska and neighboring states who want to protect their properties from development pressures while maintaining agricultural productivity and generating sustainable income through conservation partnerships that demonstrate environmental protection and economic benefits can be achieved simultaneously through innovative land use strategies that balance conservation goals with practical financial needs. The advisory work has included presentations at regional conferences, consultation with landowners facing similar family conflicts about conservation versus development decisions, and collaboration with conservation organizations to develop improved easement terms and management strategies that maximize both environmental protection and landowner benefits, while ensuring long-term habitat preservation, regardless of changing ownership or family circumstances. The educational programs being developed for the Wildlife Preserve include formal partnerships with 3 regional universities that will conduct ongoing research on prairie restoration techniques, climate change adaptation strategies, sustainable agriculture practices that integrate conservation goals with productive land use, and wildlife population monitoring that will track ecosystem health and conservation success over decades of professional management and scientific study. The university partnerships will also provide opportunities for graduate student research, undergraduate field experience programs, and faculty sabbatical projects that will generate new scientific knowledge while providing hands-on training for future conservation professionals and environmental educators who will carry conservation values and practical management skills to other properties and projects throughout the Great Plains region. The research opportunities created by permanent conservation protection will generate scientific knowledge that extends far beyond our property boundaries to influence conservation practices throughout the Great Plains region. While the educational programs will inspire future generations of environmental advocates who understand that private landowner commitment to conservation can make the critical difference between habitat preservation and environmental destruction, driven by short-term development pressures and family financial conflicts that prioritize immediate profit over long-term ecological health and biodiversity protection. The combination of research and education activities will also provide ongoing validation of the conservation decision by demonstrating the multiple benefits that flow from habitat protection, including scientific advancement, environmental education, wildlife conservation, and sustainable land use practices that can serve as models for other landowners facing similar choices between development profits and environmental stewardship. Today, 18 months after Jennifer's shocking development ultimatum and my decision to permanently protect our family farm through conservation easement dedication, the Sarah Thornfield Memorial Wildlife Preserve has become a regionally recognized model for private land conservation that balances environmental protection with sustainable agriculture and provides lasting benefits for wildlife populations, scientific research, environmental education, and conservation advocacy that honor my late wife's environmental values, while ensuring that future generations will be able to experience and study intact prairie ecosystems that are rapidly disappearing throughout the Great Plains due to development pressures and agricultural intensification, driven by short-term economic thinking. The ongoing management of the preserve includes comprehensive seasonal wildlife monitoring that has documented steadily increasing bird populations, successful establishment of rare native plant communities that had been locally extinct for over a century, and growing recognition from the scientific community that our restoration work represents one of the most successful private land conservation projects in central Nebraska's environmental history. The educational impact of the wildlife preserve has already brought over 1,200 students, teachers, and conservation professionals to participate in field programs that demonstrate successful ecosystem restoration, sustainable agriculture integration, and private landowner conservation that can inspire similar projects on other properties throughout the region, while providing practical training in habitat management, species monitoring, and conservation planning that will benefit countless future conservation projects and environmental education initiatives. The visitor programs have also included international delegations of conservation professionals who want to study our integrated approach to agriculture and habitat protection as a potential model for conservation efforts in other grassland regions around the world, where similar conflicts between development pressures and environmental protection require innovative solutions that balance economic needs with ecological stewardship and biodiversity conservation. The wisdom of my conservation decision has been validated through multiple forms of recognition that Jennifer's development proposal would have generated short-term financial profits while destroying irreplaceable ecological resources that provide long-term benefits for wildlife populations, scientific research, environmental education, and regional ecosystem health that cannot be measured in monetary terms, but represent essential contributions to environmental protection and conservation science that will benefit countless future generations of students, researchers, and wildlife populations that depend on protected habitat for their survival and continued existence in increasingly developed landscapes that prioritize economic growth over ecological sustainability and biodiversity preservation. The ongoing success of the wildlife preserve has also provided personal validation that my decision to honor Sarah's environmental values and conservation requests was the right choice despite the devastating impact on family relationships and the permanent loss of potential financial benefits that Jennifer's development proposal would have provided for our immediate family's economic security and inheritance expectations. The daily satisfaction of seeing restored prairie grasslands hosting diverse bird populations, watching rare wildflowers bloom in areas that had been degraded agricultural land just 2 decades ago, and knowing that this ecosystem will be protected forever regardless of future ownership changes or economic pressures, provides a deep sense of accomplishment and environmental legacy that far exceeds any monetary compensation or family approval that might have accompanied different decisions about property development and wealth generation. The broader impact of our conservation success extends beyond the immediate ecological benefits to include inspiration for other landowners who are facing similar choices between development profits and environmental protection, along with demonstration that conservation easements can provide viable financial alternatives to property sale, while ensuring permanent habitat protection that serves broader community and regional environmental needs. The success of our project has contributed to growing interest in private land conservation throughout Nebraska and neighboring states, with multiple landowners citing our example as motivation for their own conservation decisions that will collectively create networks of protected habitat that can support wildlife populations and ecosystem services throughout the Great Plains region despite ongoing development pressures and agricultural intensification that continue to threaten remaining natural areas. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To everyone listening to this story, I challenge you to examine your own priorities when it comes to family land and environmental responsibility, and ask yourself whether short-term financial gain is worth destroying irreplaceable natural resources that could provide lasting benefits for wildlife, scientific research, environmental education, and future generations who deserve to inherit a world where conservation values triumph over development greed, and where family members understand that some things are more valuable than money and should be protected forever regardless of immediate financial pressures, inheritance expectations, or family conflicts that prioritize material wealth over environmental stewardship and ecological legacy. Consider whether your own land use decisions, investment choices, and family discussions about property and inheritance reflect values that prioritize long-term environmental health over short-term financial gain, and whether you are prepared to make difficult decisions that protect irreplaceable natural resources even when family members or economic circumstances pressure you to choose immediate profit over permanent conservation that could benefit countless future generations of people and wildlife who depend on responsible environmental stewardship from current property owners who have the power to choose preservation over destruction. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.